Today, we're looking at a 36-year-old mother wandering the streets of a small city in New Mexico.
Right. She's bald. She weighs under 100 pounds. And she's actively refusing food or fresh clothes from the local shelters.
Yeah, and meanwhile, 2 states away, her biological son is sitting in a county jail cell. And he's being held under a staggering $5 million bond.
It's completely wild because 10 years ago, these 2 individuals were the center of this massive national tabloid sensation.
But today, we're not here to just rehash the shock value of a 2016 headline.
Mm-hmm.
We are here to dissect the devastating molecular anatomy of the fallout.
Exactly. We're looking at what actually happens to a fragile human system when it gets hit with the sledgehammer of, sudden intense public notoriety and legal separation.
It's a really critical distinction for you listening right now because the public has this incredible capacity to consume the taboo, extract the shock value, and then just discard the human beings involved.
Yeah, they really do. The story we're analyzing today, the incestuous relationship between Monica Mayers and her biological son, Caleb Peterson, it was treated entirely as a spectacle.
Right, a total circus.
But when you examine the decade-long timeline following their arrests, the narrative shifts entirely. It goes from a sensational crime to this profound, systemic unraveling. We're essentially looking at the mechanics of vulnerability.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the origin point, right? Long before the tabloids ever arrived.
Yeah, because the foundation of this entire tragedy is a massive 17-year void.
Exactly. So Monica was only 16 years old when she gave birth to Caleb, who she originally named Carlos. At 2 years old, he's put up for adoption.
And for the next 17 years, they have zero contact. None.
That isn't just a pause in a relationship,
Yeah.
That is the total erasure of a shared physical and psychological history.
Right, and to understand why that gap is so dangerous, we have to look at the biological and psychological mechanisms that prevent incest in normal human development.
Because there's a specific biological mechanism, right?
Yeah, there's this concept in evolutionary psychology known as the Westermarck effect. It was hypothesized by Edward Westermarck back in the late 19th century.
Okay, and what does that actually do?
Well, the mechanism is essentially reverse sexual imprinting. When 2 individuals live in close domestic proximity during those first few critical years of life.
Like a mother and a baby or 2 siblings.
Exactly. When they live together like that, they become biologically desensitized to sexual attraction to one another later in life. It's an evolutionary safeguard to prevent inbreeding, which obviously carries really high genetic risks.
So because Caleb was removed from her care at age 2, that biological alarm system
It just never had the chance to fully solidify.
Right.
It was entirely bypassed.
Wow.
The day-to-day friction of parenting, right? The discipline, the diaper changes, the shifting power dynamics as a child grows, that is what builds the psychological barrier against sexual attraction.
And for Monica and Caleb, that barrier simply did not exist.
Not at all. They were functionally 2 strangers who just happened to share this powerful genetic link.
And when they finally do reunite in 2015, the contrast in their realities is extreme. Caleb is now 19, and the records describe him as a physically imposing young man.
Right. He's a 6 foot, 200 pounds.
Yeah. But relatives describe his personality as deeply sensitive and protective. He's just stepping into adulthood. But Monica, at 36, is living a nightmare.
She really is. She has 7 children, she's living in poverty, and crucially, she's carrying the trauma of multiple abusive relationships.
She's in a state of profound emotional freefall.
Which creates the perfect storm for what sociologists call structural vulnerability. Monica isn't just having a hard time, her entire environment lacks the scaffolding necessary to keep her safe.
She's desperately seeking stability, safety, a protector, basically.
Yeah, and into this vacuum steps a 6 foot, 200 pound biological tether to her past.
But they didn't just bump into each other on the street, right? They reconnected on Facebook. And I think this is a critical mechanism we really need to isolate.
Oh, absolutely. The digital aspect changes everything.
We tend to view digital communication as a lesser form of connection. But I have to ask, does the sterile, text-based environment of a platform like Facebook actually artificially accelerate intimacy between estranged relatives?
That is a highly perceptive angle. Because, yes, it does.
Because when you're typing, you basically strip away the normal physical guardrails of reconnection.
Right, exactly. In communication theory, there's a concept called the hyperpersonal model. This was developed by Joseph Walther. And it posits that computer-mediated communication can actually become more socially desirable and intimate than face-to-face interaction.
Wait, more intimate than real life? How?
Well, when you're communicating via text, you have the time to optimize your presentation. You aren't dealing with the awkward body language, the shifting eyes, or even the physical pheromones of the other person. You are dealing with an avatar.
So it's an incubator. You get to project whatever you desperately need the other person to be onto that text bubble.
Bingo. For Monica, she didn't see the messy toddler she gave up. She saw this strong, protective man appearing out of nowhere.
And for Caleb, he isn't interacting with a maternal authority figure. He's interacting with a vulnerable woman who is actively communicating her distress to him.
Which places them on a completely artificial peer-to-peer playing field. Texting triggers dopamine loops in the brain without any of the real-world friction that would normally pace a relationship.
So by the time they actually met in person, the psychological groundwork for a deeply enmeshed, boundaryless relationship had already been cemented in cyberspace.
Yes, they didn't start from zero when they met face-to-face. They started from a heavily idealized fantasy they had been constructing for months.
And when that fantasy collided with physical reality, the taboo was just shattered. When they met, Monica claimed, quote, "Sparks flew almost immediately." This wasn't a gradual realization.
No, it was an instant, overwhelming connection. And the clinical term for what they likely experienced is genetic sexual attraction, or GSA.
I've heard of this happening in adoption reunions sometime.
Right, it's observed occasionally in those situations. Because they share immense genetic similarities, similar facial features, similar vocal cadences, similar neurological processing, there is an immediate, profound sense of familiarity.
But for people who have grown up together, the Westermarck effect neutralizes that familiarity into familial love.
Exactly. But without the Westermarck effect, that intense familiarity can be instantly miscoded by the brain as profound romantic or sexual chemistry.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have the testimony of Monica's mother, Sadie Baker. And Sadie provides a structural detail that shifts the entire dynamic.
Yeah, this is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
She states that Carlos Caleb was the one who made the first move. We aren't talking about a manipulative older mother preying on a naive teenager. We are looking at a 19-year-old man making a romantic overture toward a 36-year-old woman.
And the rationalizations they use to justify this are mind-bending, honestly.
Totally. How do they even square that internally?
Well, the human brain's capacity to resolve cognitive dissonance is terrifyingly efficient. Cognitive dissonance occurs when you hold two conflicting beliefs. In this case, incest is abhorrent, and I am deeply attracted to this person.
Right, the brain hates that tension.
Yeah, so to resolve the psychological stress of that conflict, the brain invents a loophole. For Monica, her loophole was entirely based on experiential absence.
Meaning, because she wasn't there.
Exactly. She argued that because she didn't raise him, because she didn't feel a maternal bond, the societal rules regarding motherhood simply didn't apply to her. She compartmentalized her biology away from her identity.
It is a complete severing of fact from feeling. She essentially decided that motherhood is an action, not a genetic reality. And since she didn't perform the action, she wasn't a mother.
Right, and Caleb's rationalization is equally warped. He claimed he was drawn to her by a deep urge to protect her from her abusive past.
Which introduces the psychology of the savior complex, right?
Oh, heavily. Caleb is a young man described as sensitive and protective, encountering a woman who has been battered by life. His instinct is to shield her.
Which, in a normal dynamic, is a positive trait.
Yes, but layered over their biological reality, it becomes compensatory hypermasculinity in the face of perceived fragility. He misinterprets his desire to rescue his estranged mother as romantic love.
The tragedy is that the very instinct driving him the desire to be a stabilizing force was fundamentally corrupted by the incestuous context.
It was poisoned from the start.
It sounds less like a traditional romance and much more like a trauma bond masquerading as a spark. You have two profoundly isolated people who are drowning in their respective lives.
Yeah, and they grabbed onto the only biological anchor they had left. And they simply refused to care that society deemed their life raft abhorrent.
But there was one person trying to puncture that delusion, right? The grandmother, Sadie Baker.
Yes, Sadie Baker functions as the immune response of the social organism here.
I like that framing. How so?
Well, when two individuals enter into an isolated shared delusion, a dynamic known in psychiatry as a folie à deux, they create a closed feedback loop. The primary individual imposes the delusion, the secondary individual accepts it, and they validate each other, walling off the outside world.
And Sadie was the outside world. She warned Monica, explicitly telling her not to do it, and she actually banned Caleb from her home.
But her warnings failed. The psychological gravity of their trauma bond was stronger than the fear of societal condemnation, at least internally.
Right, but you can't live in a closed feedback loop forever. Especially not in a place like Clovis, New Mexico. Clovis is a city of about 40,000 people. It operates on a completely different social currency than a major metropolitan area.
Definitely. A city of 40,000 operates similarly to Jeremy Bentham's concept of the panopticon.
The prison design, right, where you always feel watched.
Exactly. In a small town, you are always potentially being observed by someone who knows your history, your family, or your secrets. Anonymity is basically impossible. Social control is maintained not just by the police, but by the watchful eyes of neighbors.
And inevitably, that is exactly how the rupture occurred. A suspicious neighbor noticed the dynamic, recognized the abnormality, and tipped off the local police.
The private delusion was violently dragged right into the public square.
So the police investigate, they're confronted, and they actually admit to the relationship. In March 2017, they enter no contest pleas to incest charges in a Curry County court.
And the sentence comes down.
Right. The judge hands down a sentence of 3 years probation and a strict no-contact order. Now look at how the state handles this versus how the community handles it. The legal system is incredibly clinical.
It is. They apply the statute, issue a piece of paper mandating separation, and assign a probation officer. The state operates on the principle of punitive deterrence.
Just a surgical separation to halt the behavior.
Precisely. The goal of the probation and the no-contact order is to mechanically halt the illegal behavior. But the community operates on a much older, more visceral mechanism.
Purification through shame and violence.
Yeah. The immediate fallout is terrifying. There's intense public backlash, direct threats to Monica, and then a family home in Clovis, a house that had been in their family for years, is burned to the ground.
And Sadie Baker strongly suspects it was protest arson directed at the incestuous relationship.
Arson in this context is not just property damage. It is a deeply symbolic anthropological act. Throughout human history, fire has been used to purify and cleanse spaces tainted by taboo.
The community wasn't just expressing anger. They were attempting to erase the physical footprint of Monica and Caleb from their geography.
Right. The law says do not contact each other, but the community says you no longer have the right to exist in our space.
And we actually have a moment of intense regret from Monica right after this. She's crying to her mother, admitting it was, quote, a mistake.
And what does Sadie say?
Sadie just replied, I told you. Just brutal. But, this is where I have to push back on the concept of how the justice system operates in cases of profound psychological dysfunction.
Okay, let's hear it.
I understand the state has to enforce the law. Incest is illegal. But look at the mechanism of that court order. By mandating a strict, immediate no-contact order, the court took two severely damaged people who were entirely dependent on each other for psychological survival and forcibly amputated that bond.
It's a blunt instrument.
Right. So did the clinical nature of that justice practically guarantee their mutual destruction?
I would argue that your premise highlights a massive blind spot in jurisprudence. The justice system is designed to penalize actions, not treat the underlying pathology that causes those actions.
It's just cause and effect for them.
Exactly. The court recognized the crime of incest, but it completely ignored the reality of the trauma bond. When you forcibly separate two individuals in a highly enmeshed, codependent relationship without providing rigorous, state-mandated psychiatric scaffolding to replace that bond,
you induce a psychological freefall.
Yes. The law branded them with a felony, severed their only support system, and dropped them back into a community that was actively burning down their property.
The system was highly efficient at stopping the crime, but structurally incapable of preventing the collapse of the individuals.
And that collapse is exactly where the narrative splits. We have to follow the trajectory of both mother and son after that court-mandated amputation.
Okay, let's trace Caleb's path first. He is forced to leave Clovis. He moves to Melrose, which is a tiny rural community, and eventually crosses state lines to Pueblo, Colorado, where he reportedly finds work as a handyman.
Notice the geography of his movements. It's a slow drift into exile. He is attempting to outrun the intense gravitational pull of his notoriety in Clovis.
But the psychological unraveling follows him. The records show a man who fundamentally cannot stabilize. He begins racking up a specific type of criminal history.
We're talking probation violations, traffic charges, driving on a revoked license, and 2 DUIs.
And I find that fascinating. Why that specific profile of crime? If he was just a bad person, you'd expect violence or theft. But these are distinct.
Because these are crimes of profound instability and executive dysfunction. They are the actions of someone who has lost their anchor.
I see.
Remember, he entered this dynamic viewing himself as a protector. He had a defined, albeit warped, purpose. When the state stripped that purpose away and branded him a felon, his identity crumbled.
So it's not premeditated malice.
Not at all. Driving on a revoked license or getting a DUI isn't about malicious intent. It's about a total disregard for the structural rules of a society that he feels has already exiled him. It is low-level, continuous self-sabotage.
But that low-level sabotage eventually hits a terrifying crescendo. On April 8th, 2024, he's arrested by the Pueblo County Sheriff's Department.
And what were the charges?
The charges are criminal trespassing and criminal mischief. On paper, these are misdemeanors or low-level felonies at worst. But the authorities confirm he is being held on a $5 million bond.
It's an astronomical number.
When I read that, it stopped me in my tracks. A $5 million bond for trespassing.
Well, we have to look at the mechanics of the U.S. bail system to understand how a seemingly minor charge results in a catastrophic bond amount.
Because it doesn't make sense on the surface.
Right. Bail is not meant to be a punishment. Mechanically, it's a financial lever used to ensure a defendant returns for their court date. Judges use risk assessment algorithms, like the public safety assessment, to determine flight risk.
Okay, so they run his history through an algorithm.
Exactly. And in Caleb's case, a $5 million bond is what the legal system calls a remand in disguise.
Meaning they don't actually expect him to pay it.
Mathematically, he cannot. A rural handyman cannot post $5 million. What that number actually represents is the compounding weight of systemic failure.
How so?
The court sees a defendant with a decade-long history of probation violations. They see a history of transient movement across state lines. And crucially, they see an active 2024 warrant out of Clovis.
Oh, so the old ghosts caught up to him.
Yes. When a judge looks at that matrix, the algorithm determines that this individual is entirely incapable of adhering to a court mandate. The $5 million bond is the system throwing its hands up.
They can't legally deny him bail for a trespassing charge, so they set a price tag that effectively guarantees he will remain incarcerated.
It is the ultimate systemic ghosting.
He tried to be a savior at 19, and by his late 20s, he is buried under a mountain of administrative warrants and a bond that is effectively a life sentence in county jail. His unraveling was geographic and bureaucratic.
Yeah, but while Caleb was being swallowed by the legal system in Colorado, Monica's destruction was happening in broad daylight on the streets of her hometown.
And Monica's descent requires us to examine the physical manifestation of psychological ruin, because after the separation, she attempts to mimic normalcy. In November 2018, she marries another man, Joe Garza.
But the institution of marriage cannot serve as a retroactive cure for complex trauma. The source material details a physical deterioration that is medically and psychologically alarming.
The mugshots are haunting, honestly. The records describe her prior to the scandal as heavier-set brunette with a bright smile. But the subsequent photos show a woman who is bald, gaunt, and weighing under 100 pounds.
It's a total erasure of her former self.
Her mother, Sadie, looking at old photos, simply says, "She looked like me. She was a beautiful girl." And regarding the baldness, Sadie notes, "I don't know why. She is mad at herself, I guess."
Sadie's intuition regarding the baldness is clinically profound.
Why did you say that?
Well, when an individual experiences overwhelming public shaming and severe trauma, it often leads to a condition where they internalize the disgust of the community.
So she's taking all that external hatred and directing it inward.
Exactly. The town burned her house down. They told her she was a monster. Shaving one's head or refusing to eat, dropping below 100 pounds are mechanisms of self-erasure.
It's a way of making yourself disappear.
In psychology, deliberate alteration of the body to make oneself unappealing or invisible is a common trauma response. It is a physical act of apology. She is ensuring that her outward appearance matches the complete devastation she feels internally.
It's akin to cellular apoptosis, right? Like programmed cell death, but applied to a human identity.
That's a grim but incredibly accurate analogy, yes.
And that self-erasure is hyper-accelerated by severe substance abuse. In July 2020, we see this terrifying intersection of her trauma and addiction.
The arson arrest.
Right. She is arrested for negligent arson after starting a backyard fire. And according to the criminal complaint, she tells the officers she is coming down from a days-long high on yellow meth.
The chemical reality of methamphetamine addiction is critical here. Methamphetamines aggressively flood the brain's synapses with dopamine, but prolonged use destroys those very receptors.
And yellow meth specifically, what does that indicate?
Yellow meth often refers to an unrefined, heavily chemically contaminated batch of the drug, which accelerates neurotoxicity. It induces severe paranoia, sleep deprivation, and acute psychosis.
Wow.
But the most revealing aspect of this 2020 arrest isn't the drug use itself, it is the legal outcome.
Right, because the charges are ultimately dismissed. The court declares her unfit to stand trial.
We really need to consider the legal mechanics of that phrase. To be found unfit to stand trial based on the dusky standard established by the Supreme Court, a defendant must lack the sufficient present ability to consult with their lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding.
Is that a high bar to clear?
No, it is a remarkably low bar to clear. You do not have to be highly intelligent or completely sane to stand trial. You just have to understand what a judge is.
Oh, wow. So if she can't even meet that standard.
Exactly. By declaring Monica unfit, the state is medically acknowledging that her cognitive function has been entirely obliterated. The person who committed the crime of incest essentially no longer exists inside that brain.
Which brings us to the most visceral image of this entire deep dive. Today, Monica is homeless in Clovis. She drifts in and out of the Mission Lighthouse shelter.
And the details from the shelter workers are just heartbreaking.
Yeah, a shelter worker named Debbie provides these incredibly specific details. Monica wears the exact same old, tattered shoes every single day. She outright refuses fresh clothes. She refuses food.
It's a continuation of that self-erasure we talked about.
Yeah, and Debbie notes she is in a state of, quote, psychosis. And when offered help, Monica simply gives a stoic smirk.
Let's analyze that smirk, because it is not an expression of amusement. It is a profound psychiatric defense mechanism.
How so?
When a person is locked in a state of psychosis brought on by severe trauma and neurotoxic drug use, their reality testing fails. The smirk is a barrier. It communicates a total disconnection from the social contract.
Like she's beyond our reach.
It essentially says, your attempts to apply normal human empathy to my situation are absurd, because you cannot possibly comprehend the depth of my ruin. Furthermore, the refusal of fresh clothes and the clinging to the tattered shoes are continued acts of self-flagellation. She believes she does not deserve the dignity of clean clothing.
It's devastating. You look at these two paths. The son locked in a bureaucratic cage he can never pay his way out of, and the mother wandering the streets, actively rejecting any lifeline, trapped in a cage made of her own broken neurology.
It really forces you to step back and look at the bigger picture.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out from the visceral horror of the present day, what is the ultimate takeaway from this decade-long timeline?
We have to reevaluate the true timeline of vulnerability. The source material provides a vital piece of context from Monica's older sister, Debbie Pastor.
Right, the sister.
She points out that Monica was deeply vulnerable financially and emotionally long before Caleb ever found her on Facebook.
That is the crux of it. We look at the incest scandal as the bomb that destroyed her life. But it wasn't the bomb. It was the inevitable explosion of a pre-existing leak.
Yes, Monica was already drowning. She was a mother of 7, enduring abusive relationships, living in poverty.
But society didn't write national headlines about a struggling, impoverished mother.
Of course not. The public only paid attention. The police only intervened. The town only mobilized when her extreme vulnerability manifested as a spectacular taboo crime.
It is an indictment of how we allocate empathy. The sister, Debbie Pastor, notes that she now prays every day, knowing Monica's really high on drugs and living on the streets.
And yet the community's engagement with her story has entirely ceased. The article notes that the romance now survives merely as a cautionary tale whispered about in Clovis.
Just a ghost story for the locals.
In anthropological terms, a cautionary tale is how a society uses the destruction of an outcast to define its own moral boundaries. The town uses their story to say, look at what happens when you break the rules, while completely ignoring the human being starving on their sidewalk.
They extracted the moral lesson and discarded the human beings. It is a brutal reality.
It really is.
Over the course of this hour, we have traced a timeline that defies simple categorization. We looked at a 17-year void that bypassed the biological safeguards of the Westermarck effect. We analyzed how the sterile environment of text-based communication incubated a trauma bond disguised as a savior complex.
We watched the clinical efficiency of the legal system collide with the violent vigilantism of a small town.
Yeah, and we tracked how forcibly severing that toxic bond didn't heal anyone. It pushed Caleb into a spiral of systemic transient failure and drove Monica into a neurotoxic psychosis where she actively erases her own existence.
The mechanisms of human destruction are complex, but they are identifiable if we are willing to look past the sensationalism of a headline.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. We have seen that when society and the legal system encounter a profoundly broken, taboo dynamic, we possess incredibly efficient machinery to punish it. We know how to draft the warrants, calculate the $5 million bonds, and burn the houses to the ground.
We're very good at the destruction part.
We really are. But as Monica wanders the streets in psychosis, clinging to tattered shoes, we have to ask ourselves, if our systems are so exceptionally engineered to end the scandal, why are they so utterly incapable of treating the shattered pieces left behind? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive and for helping us dissect the true mechanics of the stories that shape us. We'll see you next time.